This is the presentation about homicide. The word homicide comes from two Latin words, homo and cadere. Homo is the Latin word for human being, and cadere comes from the Latin word for to kill, homicidium. That's what we call homicide. What is homicide? According to Canadian law, the Criminal Code of Canada, in section 222, subsection 1, says a person commits homicide when, directly or indirectly, by any means, he causes the death of a human being. So homicide is very general. Anytime you cause the death of a human being, you're committing homicide. Now, there are two types of homicide, and this is very important. There's culpable homicide, and there's not culpable homicide. Culpable just means blameworthy or responsible. So if it's not culpable homicide, that means you're not to be blamed. There's no blame to be given. And if you're not blameworthy, therefore there's no punishment. In other words, not culpable homicide isn't about the criminal law. Things like accidents, things happen. Sometimes people die. Sometimes it's caused by somebody, but there's no fault to be attached. That's not culpable homicide. What we're going to be concerned about is only culpable homicide. In other words, everything within this circle, the large circle, is culpable homicide. What is culpable homicide? We again look to section 222 of the Criminal Code, and in particular, subsection 5. And it has these 4 different categories of culpable homicide. As it says, a person commits culpable homicide when he causes the death of a human being, A, by means of an unlawful act, B, by criminal negligence, C, by causing that human being, in other words, the human being that is killed, by causing that human being by threats or fear of violence or by deception to do anything that causes his death. So in other words, the person causes their own death as a result of threats or fear or violence or deception that's done by the person. Or D, by willfully frightening that human being, frightening a person to death in the case of a child or a sick person. Now, C and D don't happen very often. They're pretty unusual. A and B is where it's at. A is if you're committing an unlawful act and that causes the death of a human being, it's automatically culpable homicide. B is if you are criminally negligent and that causes the death of a human being, that is also culpable homicide. A and B is where most of this is at. A or B or C or D all are culpable homicide. A and B is where you find most cases. Now, what is criminal negligence? Section 219 of the Criminal Code says, everyone is criminally negligent who, in doing anything or in omitting to do anything that is his duty to do, shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. We can break this down into 2 parts. Let's just forget that line that starts with B for a moment. Everyone is criminally negligent who, in doing anything, shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives and safety of other people. In other words, if you do something that shows careless, a excessive disregard for a person's life or their safety, if you do something like that, you are being criminally negligent. And if that results in a person dying, that's culpable homicide. Or if we just look at B, everyone is criminally negligent who, in omitting to do anything that is his duty to do, shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. If you are duty-bound to do something and you don't do it, you omit to do it, that is criminal negligence if it shows what you've omitted to do shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives or safety of other persons. So keep in mind that those are the 2 key areas. A person commits culpable homicide when he causes the death of a human being, A, by means of an unlawful act, or B, by criminal negligence. If you have either of those things in the context of someone causing the death of a human being, it's culpable homicide. And when it's culpable homicide, it means it's inside this big bubble. It means there is blame to be given, and there will be punishment handed out to the guilty party. As you can see here, there are 3 types of culpable homicide: infanticide, murder, and manslaughter. And we'll look at those one at a time. Infanticide, as you can imagine, is exactly what it looks like. It's the killing of an infant. Homicide, the killing of a person, a human being. Infanticide is the killing of a human being that is an infant. This is a very unique crime in that it can only be committed by a woman. And it can only be committed by a woman who is causing the death of her newborn child as a result of her suffering from some sort of a mental disturbance. This is an old crime. It's an odd crime, but it is a crime nonetheless. This is an example of a case. A woman ended up at a hospital, and she had complications as a result of a childbirth. And the people at the hospital started wondering, well, where's the baby? And she couldn't answer the question. And so they ended up investigating it, and they found a deceased infant baby inside a city garbage truck. They did an autopsy. They determined the child was hers and that the child was alive at the time of birth. She was sentenced with infanticide, or charged with infanticide. She pled guilty, and the prosecution submitted that no jail sentence is necessary. A maximum punishment of 5 years is possible, but they suggested no jail sentence. She had been examined by a psychiatrist. This is always part of an infanticide case because of that mental disturbance part of the crime. And she was found to be in a disturbed state of mind at the time that she did the killing, not capable of fully understanding the implications of her actions, and therefore it was suggested that she be sentenced to 1 year of house arrest, followed by 2 years of probation. And that's what the defense and the Crown both suggested would be an appropriate punishment in this case. Infanticide has changed over the years, and essentially now it's seen that the crime has 2 victims. Obviously, the baby that was killed, but the mother, who was suffering from some sort of mental disturbance, who did the killing, is often looked at sympathetically. In this case, no jail time, for example. Murder is the second category. Murder is a lot more complicated. It can be committed, as all other crimes are, by a man or a woman, anyone. And it has a complex definition of what a murder is in Section 229 of the Criminal Code of Canada. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the simplest version is in Section 229, subsection A, where it says culpable homicide. Now note that it's culpable homicide. We're inside the big bubble. So everything here we're talking about is culpable homicide. Culpable homicide is murder where the person who causes the death of a human being means to cause his death. That's part I. So obviously that's the simplest one. You cause the death of a human being and you meant to do it. That's murder. Or, and then we look at the next part, means to cause him bodily harm that he knows is likely to cause his death and is reckless whether or not death ensues or not. So even if you don't mean to kill a person, but you cause sufficient bodily harm and you know is likely to kill the person, and you don't really care, you're reckless about whether the person dies, that's also going to be considered culpable homicide and murder. The second subsection, B, is basically the exact same as A, except by accident or mistake, you caused the death to a person you didn't mean to. So it's exactly the same. Either you meant to do it and you did it, or you meant to cause the person bodily harm and you were reckless about whether he died or not, and you knew that it was likely the person was going to die, but by accident or mistake, you got the wrong person. That's still murder. And then there's this third section. I'm just going to let this go for now. It's a little more complicated. It has a legal history to it, which is a little bit more complicated. But for present purposes, you can read this over, try and understand it. But let's just focus on A and B of Section 229 for now as the definitions for murder. Now, murder is either first-degree murder or second-degree murder. So what's the difference? First-degree murder, in the basic, most fundamental meaning of it, is that if you murdered someone and you planned it, you thought it out carefully, and it was deliberate, not something that you impulsively did. So if it was planned and deliberate, it's considered first-degree murder. Also, there's a series of crimes wherein if you commit murder or if you commit murder during the commission of those particular crimes, it will be considered first-degree murder. No, those crimes are listed in this section of the Criminal Code, these sections of the Criminal Code. And finally, if your victim is a law enforcement officer, then it's automatically considered first-degree murder. So in other words, even if it wasn't planned and deliberate, if it's a police officer that you murdered, it will be first-degree murder. Here's an example of a person who stole a snowplow in the middle of a storm in Toronto. And in the process of driving around, the police were called. He was hitting cars and things like that. The police were called, and a police officer tried to confront him, and the snowplow hit the police officer while he was outside his car and killed the police officer. The person that stole the snowplow and drove it into the police officer was charged with first-degree murder. It didn't matter whether it was planned and deliberate. The fact of the matter was this was a police officer that was killed, and first-degree murder is the charge that is laid in such a case. Finally, second-degree murder. Fairly simple. If it's murder, but it's not first-degree murder, it doesn't fall into those three categories that I just mentioned, then it's second-degree murder. Because all murder is either first or second. So there's three specific categories of first-degree murder. If it's not one of those, it has to be second-degree murder. And finally, manslaughter. Everyone wonders, what's manslaughter? Well, the only way you can know whether it's manslaughter or not is to first figure out, 1, is it homicide? Did you cause the death of a human being? 2, is it culpable homicide? Did you cause that person's death by means of an unlawful act or by means of criminal negligence? Then it's culpable. If it's culpable homicide, was it infanticide? No? Okay. Was it murder? If you say it's not murder, according to the definition of murder, then what you've got left is manslaughter. In other words, if it's culpable homicide but not infanticide and not murder, it has to be manslaughter. So you have to think of an example where it's culpable homicide but not infanticide and not murder. That's what makes it manslaughter. If a person commits manslaughter, I should say that differently. If a person commits murder, there is an option to reduce the charge to manslaughter if the person did the murder in the heat of passion caused by a sudden provocation. If you're inflamed with passion for some reason and you're angry and all of a sudden it comes out of nowhere and it wasn't planned or anything like that, but it was murder, you meant to kill the person and you killed them. But if it was in the heat of passion, sudden provocation, there's the option to reduce it to manslaughter, and the punishment could be less. That's the law of homicide as it's in the Criminal Code of Canada.